Hello kiddies, this is part 3 of Curse of the Crypt Keeper, Horror Nights history. Now, again, be sure you watch part 1 first, then watch part 2 after that, but before you watch part 3, and then, after you watch both part 1 and part 2, proceed directly to part 3. And if I go too long on this as well, you'll have to go to part 4 afterwards. If there is one. There may very well be we'll have to wait. Okay. Now, I was talking about the haunted houses, and the haunted house called Universal's House of Horror. Now, it was actually Universal's Houses of Horror, although they didn't call it that, because there were 2 separate houses. This concept would continue for 4 years in a row. From 95, 96, 97, 98. It was called something different every time. House, museum, you know, they had a slightly different name. But every single time what they did was they had a house of Universal. It was a movie-themed house of many different movies. And you have 2 entirely separate houses with 2 separate queue lines. And when you went into one side, it was classic Universal monsters. You had stuff, the Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Bride of Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Invisible Man. Now, I'm not saying all of those characters appeared at the same time in the same house that year in 1995. Some of those didn't even appear ever, but I'm talking who, generally what we're talking about. The Mummy, you know, some of them appeared in 94, and they switched them up a little bit over the 4 years. A little bit. Some guys came back, some guys were added in. On the other side, it was always new stuff. It was always Scream, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. Of course, they wouldn't use those names, and they didn't name the characters, but you knew who Freddy, Jason, and the Ghostface Killer were. The Exorcist, Candyman, all sorts of other characters might appear on the new side. Now this first year, I'm sure Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman were there, and on the other side I think Chucky and a couple others were there on that side. But I can't remember for sure exactly which characters were in each of the houses over those 4 years, because they blend together in my brain, because they all had the same concept. Now, if there's some nice people out there who are really anal in the 1990s and wrote everything down and know exactly which movies appeared on the classic and modern side of each one of these house museum of horror type houses they had from 1995, 96, 97, 98, and could send it to me in one form or another, I'd be highly appreciative, because I'd like to have that information handy. I mean, I know about some of them. I know for sure, like, you know, Poltergeist and The Exorcist were definitely a part of the one in 98. And a few other things I can, clearly remember from what year. But it becomes a blur, 15, 13 to 15 years later, actually it's 12 to 15 years later, trying to remember which house, which year had which movie scenes. It kind of, since it wasn't like you had a vault or something back then where everybody discussed it, and there's lots of forums with all the written records of which one was in which room, and then you can, you can refer, it's easy to remember stuff now because you can go back and read your own reviews of the houses, or at least you used to when the vault was still in existence. But you can remember writing them better, because if you write something down, you remember it better. And back then I wasn't keeping track. I wasn't thinking that years from now I'll be making a video trying to remember which horror movie scene was in which house over a period of 4 years. But it was a good idea, and it was good enough that they repeated it, as I said, 3 more times. So there's a connection for you. The other houses that year were the Crypt Keeper's Dungeon of Terror, and that way the Dungeon of Terror was brought back as the Crypt Keeper's house, and this was held in the Earthquake Queue, which had become the new home for the Dungeon of Terror, But it was unlike any previous Dungeon of Terror. Essentially, it was the Crypt Keeper's mansion from Tales from the Crypt. You remember the opening scene where when you go through and the music plays, dun, 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 and you go through the doors and you find your down into the crypt. Well, in this house, you actually went through the rooms. You'd go into a room that was like a library full of creepy things, or another room that might be the parlor, and it was like being in a haunted mansion. That was the Crypt Keeper's mansion. There was a room where there was a hunting room, trophy room, and all the trophies were human heads. I remember all the human heads staring at you. And that was the sort of thing that it was. So you got to visit the Crypt Keeper's own haunted mansion, basically, and he was in the crypt when you got to it. So that was that. The third house was in Nazerman's, and it was called Terror Underground, Transit to Torment, and it was like you're in a subway of terror. This theme would be used much better when they started making subway, a similar idea of having a subway being attacked in the Disaster Queue area house. It seemed more suited for that in later years. So the idea of a subway under attack pops up again in the year 1999, the Doomsday House. Not to be confused with the more recent movie, Doomsday House. Terror Underground, though, took you underground, where you had all sorts of freaks and mutants and rats and horrible things happening in the depths of the New York subway, which had this horrible thing happen, this apocalyptic thing. But I remember a lot of flat cardboard-looking sets that they look better in the dark with proper lighting. All right, so that's that. Now, there were, again, Horrorwood Boulevard, and it was a random assortment of various characters of the most, again, the Chainsaw Drill Team were there, as always, but all sorts of other characters from mutant freaks to gorgeous chicks that would distract you, to good-looking dudes that would distract you, to weird animal heads and twisted zombies and whatnot. Anything you could possibly imagine in the haunted, because it was, again, a random assortment of ghouls and vampires, what have you. Midway of the Bazaar was the other scare zone, and this had a better themed idea. It was placed up in the Amity Village area. Oh, I on that little bitty a video I did yesterday about the brochure, I forgot to mention there was a big error in that brochure, the 94 brochure. It said the Boneyard was in Amity Village. The Boneyard is nowhere near Amity Village. So if you have a 94 brochure, it should be a collector's item because it's got a misprint. It tells you that one of the houses is not where it's supposed to be. In fact, if you look at the map, you'll see how it contradicts itself, because the map clearly shows where the Boneyard is. Nowhere near, nowhere near Amity. That's just another bit of trivia. All right. Midway of the Bazaar, we had clowns and also sort of Mardi Gras, Day of the Dead type carnivalesque characters with skull faces, but happy, like Baron Samedi. If you know your voodoo, there's the Lord of the Cemetery, the Baron Saturday in English, Baron Samedi, who is one of the barons who are the Loa, who are the spirits who are guardians of life and death and everything, and he's like in charge of death and the afterlife. And so if you want to pray for the dead, you would first pray to Legba, who is the keeper of the opener, sort of like Ganesh in Hinduism, or maybe the Virgin Mary in Christianity. If you're Catholic, you might want to go through Mary or Peter or one of the saints before you get to God for intercession. So the idea is that to get to the God you really want to pray to, you go to the first one, and he sort of opens the door of channel of communications. There are a lot of religions that have stuff like that. Hermes, before you get to Zeus, type of idea. So first Legba opens the path, and after Legba you can get to Samedi. Of course, in voodoo, oftentimes it's not so much prayer as the God comes to you, because if you're really good at it, you become the God. You become the God's horse, and the God will possess you and will speak through you, and the other worshippers will hear the actual voice of the God coming out of your, and you won't remember what happened until later. It's sort of like being filled with spirit, but a little more extreme. Okay, so Samedi, his attributes are he's a skeleton who dresses really fine in a tuxedo with a hat, top hat, and he's usually partying and dancing. He's a rather happy skeleton. So the happy skeleton archetype exists in that religion, and also, of course, in Mexico, the happy skeleton dancing for the Day of the Dead. So this had a lot of that because you had people in skeletons dancing around bright colors, but they also were scaring the hell out of you because there was lots of fog, and they come jumping out from behind something, and noisemakers, and clowns, and jesters, and but it was like a carnival atmosphere because it was Mardi Gras, it was Day of the Dead, it was Carnival, but it was evil and full of full of monstrous clowns and merrymakers of the damned. The Togtentants, Dance Macabre, whatever you want to call it. The Carnival. In fact, Carnival is, in Latin, literally means farewell to the flesh. So think about that. Anyway, it's an archetype, and it fits in perfectly. And this was a scare zone that would be done over and over and over again for years. And this year, if you want to talk connections, there are two scare zones that are direct descendants of the Midway of the Bazaar. We have the Zombie Gras and the Esqueleto Muerta happening this year. And both of those, it's like Starbucks, where you're stupid in 3 languages, because the concepts are cool, but Zombie Gras in French means fat zombie. And Esqueleto Muerta means dead skeleton in Spanish. Dead skeleton? Well, gee, aren't they all dead? Maybe Esqueleto Vido, or something like that. I was going to say Esqueleto Viventi, except that would be Italian and Spanish mixed up together. Viventi. And that really would be like getting a latte grande, whatever, frappuccino, like Paul Rudd joke in that movie, World Models. Yeah. If you didn't get the joke reference before, I'm making it explicit now. Oh. So, connections to this day. Again, this stuff will be important in Legendary Truth investigations that are upcoming, because we want to connect to see how fear has actually been around and the connections between year to year. At least that's what they said in the conference call. And I assume they were not, yanking our chains. They wouldn't do that. So we have the scare zones of those two. We had our first icon. It was now extended to 12 nights, by the way. I didn't write down the actual nights, but it was 12 nights now. So it's extending longer and further into the October. Eventually it would expand outside the boundaries of October. Here and now, it was 12 nights. Remember, 3 nights, 5 nights, 5 nights, 8 nights. Now, 12 nights. Wow. That's almost 2 weeks, if you put them all together. So, there was another show, however, an outdoor show. I think this was the first time they used the lagoon for Halloween Horror Nights. I'm pretty sure it was. And they had what they called the Nights of Hell. Now, it was promoted as the Crypt Keeper's Nights of Hell, but instead of the little puppet, when he appeared, he looked like a huge, tall, 6'4" version of the Crypt Keeper with more of a skull-like face with long hair. So it was, and a sort of robe. So I guess it could be the Crypt Keeper when he was in his 20s and young and buff, and then he got crinkly and old and decrepit when he got old. I don't know. But anyway, he was like a projection, and he was talking about the Nights of Hell, and they had these boats, basically, with skulls and demonic shit on them, and they were like having a duel on the water, like a joust or whatever, with fire and everything else. And it was basically a water stunt show like they did during the day, but dressed up in Halloween clothes for night. Basically, is what it was. They had a water stunt show on the Universal Lagoon back in those days. I don't think they do that now, do they? Again, how often do I get to Universal during the day when it isn't Halloween Horror Nights? So, you may need to help me on that. Okay, so I'm looking at my notes. I think I covered everything. Oh, wait. Bill and Ted, of course. Bill and Ted had another excellent adventure, their 4th excellent adventure that year. And again, these bleed together in my memory, so I'm not quite certain who they encountered that year, but it was most excellent, I'm sure. And once again, they brought back Beetlejuice in the Animal Activist Theater, no, the Animal Actor Theater, at PETA for for his murder. No, not that kind of animal, not animal activist, animal actor theater for the Price is Fright game show once again, which I never saw. So that was Halloween Horror Nights 1995. Next time, we journey into fear!